When they asked me to teach a class on writing a family history, I thought, let's narrow that down a little. But I have my bachelor's degree in English. I have written a couple of family histories. I guess I would call one kind of a memoir, really. And I decided to talk about specifically how do we incorporate family trauma. And not only that, but especially why would we? Nobody wants to talk about trauma. And there's good reason for that, right? Because you relive the experience. Because even if you didn't go through that and you hear about it, it can traumatize you, right? So as historians, as family historians especially, we need to know. And I'm going to let you know why. So we're going to talk about some studies that discuss family trauma. We're going to talk about how to bring that family trauma to the surface. I was talking to my in-laws about grandpa, and he was in, is it Korean? Okay, so the Korean War. And we did not get any of his stories. It just kills me that we did not get his stories. How do you go to that stoic, brave, we don't talk about it kind of generation and get them to open up? And we're going to talk about some of the options for self-publishing, and then we are also going to give examples of how I or other people have written about trauma. Okay, so we have some literary examples, we have some personal examples. So starting with the studies, this is Dr. Judith Landau. You can see she's quite educated. She pioneered studies in generational trauma. She has a mode of therapy for treating unhealthy coping mechanisms, so addiction, right? It's called Arise. And she works specifically with family units. It's not just the addict goes to the clinic and we hope that they get better. She's found that you have all of these auxiliary people, the therapist, counselors, addiction, all of those people, it takes 5 of them to replace one family member in therapy when you talk about effectiveness of having someone there with you. As she studied, she always asked this question. Look at your family history. Where's the trauma? You're Irish? Well, were your grandparents in the potato famine? When did they immigrate? Why did they immigrate? What happened? What she found is that across 100 different cultures, there was the same pattern emerging when it came to trauma. And this is 5 generational model. So you have these 5 lines, they each represent a generation, and each little dot is a person on them. So going back to the potato famine in Ireland, right? Let's say you have one son here who watches his siblings starve to death, and they decide to send him to America. So he comes and has no way of coping. He's young. Usually they sent children to America as immigrants. And he has no way of really coping with the fact that he just saw his siblings die. He's now totally isolated from his family members. And so he starts drinking as a way of coping. And there were people who didn't even do that. There were people who did commit suicide. There were people who they died because they became ill, but he was strong. He didn't die when he became ill. And this is how he chose to cope. So then she explores how it passes from generation to generation, and the highest trauma level occurs at the 3rd generation, coming down. And then the 4th generation, the trauma settles down a little bit, and by the 5th generation, the family as a whole is finally able to process the trauma. She found that trauma really is processed in family groups. There's not just one person who has to deal with it. So she started family transitional therapy. One of the studies that her group did with regard to family stories is they looked at risky behavior, and they looked specifically at women who were engaging in high-risk sexual behavior. So these were women who would have unprotected sex with multiple partners, or they would also have like drug use involved. And so there was a scale of like, okay, there's low risk or no risk behavior, moderate, and high risk behavior, being with all of those other addictive kind of things thrown into it. The questioned 3 different groups of women: those in an STD clinic, those who were in a center for troubled adolescent girls, and then just women at a community center as a control, right? No trauma at the surface with that group. And her team asked all of these women the same 3 questions. How well do you know your family stories across multiple generations? And then they collected those stories from those women. They asked them how well they knew their culture. Can you explain your culture to me? And then they asked them how much contact they had with family members at that time. What they found was that among those women, those who had the lowest amount of risky behavior knew family stories of resilience. Those women who were engaging in moderately risky behavior, they knew their family stories, but they were stories of trauma and extreme vulnerability. And then the highest risk-taking group did not know any family stories at all. Because the highest risk group did not know any family stories, they focused on like the moderate and the low risk groups. And they analyzed the stories. And for the group that engaged in moderately risky behavior, and they have those stories of extreme vulnerability, these are what the stories told about. They told about murder, suicide, addiction, and all of that carrying across multiple generations in their family. And so then they went to the stories from the group where they told stories of resilience, and you know what those stories were about? The exact same thing. So I want you to look at that. They're telling the same stories. On one hand, you had a family who said, we survived this trauma. And on the other hand, you had a family that said, look, all of these awful things have happened, and that's just how our family is. We're stuck. The thing is, though, I want you to keep in mind that even the stories of extreme vulnerability, even with the kind of victim mentality, they had more benefit than people who did not know the stories at all. What we need to understand is that our family history, our stories, they hold power. They hold the power to healing. I talked about this model that Dr. Landau found that was consistent across 100 different cultures. What she found was that if a person tried to break out of addiction, so let's say they're alcoholics, if they tried to break out of alcoholism, they would be dragged back in. And that happened consistently across 5 generations until they went in and they said, what was the trauma? Oh, well, his siblings died. He came to America alone. And they started discussing everything that had happened to traumatize the people in the family. And when they understood, they were able to break out of addiction. Within 2 generations, within 3 generations, they could break the addiction. Not talking about the trauma is what perpetuates the cycle. All right? Because you even saw, even with a moderate risk-taking group, they still had less risky behavior than the group who didn't talk about it at all. Okay, so we do not want to avoid past trauma, as hard as that might be. We want to face it and embrace it. We do want to create a narrative of resilience, and we have that choice. So in my background, I have genocide. And I can look at my family history and I can say, we were victimized. And that is absolutely true. And I can look at it, the same family, and say, we survived. And that is absolutely true. So what story am I going to tell? As I was growing up and I heard stories of genocide, and I had nightmares as a child because I heard, stories of genocide, but I was always told, we are strong. We are the strongest. We survived. And so for me, this is very much, I didn't come across Dr. Landau's work until, like 5 years ago at most. And it really, really resonated with me. I thought, wow, I have seen this. This is my life. The problem is, when you tell a traumatic story, if you traumatize your reader, they're not going to tell people to go and look at that wonderful story, right? So I have this memoir that was written by Mary. This is Mary. She was my grandmother's niece, and she married my great uncle, okay? They found her in an orphanage, and anyway, she ended up marrying my great uncle. I got her memoir when I was in college. I read it just there on my own, and never picked it up again until I decided what this class should be about. And I thought, well, it's time to pick up Mary's memoir again. Reading it again did not affect me the same way. I mean, not nearly. Okay, but I want to talk about really quickly, there's a quote that we're going to look at that talks about looking at family stories as a group, okay, versus like what I did is reading it alone, right? So you're writing your family history. There's an oral tradition as well, right? Telling family stories. And my family was very, very much like into the oral tradition of telling family stories. And this is what happens when you're together, or even over Zoom, and you tell those family stories together. Stories reveal the feelings that accompanied the experience. They enable each family member to deal with potentially intense emotions within the context of a story and within the safety of the family unit. The act of family storytelling provides collective experiences of emotional co-regulation. So I read Mary's journal on my own as a college student and never wanted to pick it up again. I heard stories just as traumatic on a family Zoom, but because I was there with my siblings, it's like the emotion spread. We kind of shared it, right? And so it was an entirely different experience. We're in that situation, though, where we're writing a family history. We don't necessarily have the benefit of co-regulation. What are we going to do? We need to be artful in conveying, okay, this hard thing happened. All right, so before we really start getting into examples of that, let's talk about, grandpa or that stoic generation who does not want to talk about the trauma. How do we help them open up? Well, first of all, I think it helps to understand how important trauma is to empowering family members, to promoting healing. They don't heal alone. We don't heal alone. We do that as a family. And that's important for them to know. So I should say, okay, I didn't talk about the mice study. I probably should. So first, really quick, when I collect stories, I try to be aware of the fact that our memory is super faulty. By the time you're 5 years away from something, if they didn't keep a journal, if any of that, like Mary wrote a memoir, and I look at 90% of what she wrote and I think, yeah, well, that's what she's saying 60 years later. How do I know how accurate that is? But this is what they found with soldiers. They took soldiers who showed signs of trauma and PTSD, and they took soldiers who did not show signs of trauma. And the group who did not show signs of trauma over the course of 45 years, because that's how long they ran this, after 45 years, their stories had totally changed. But the group who had experienced trauma, for 45 years, their story stayed the same. When we experience trauma, it bypasses our short-term memory, goes straight into our long-term memory, and it becomes enmeshed with emotion and all of these different sensations. So it's coded differently in our mind. It doesn't mean that we have a photographic memory of that event, because trauma also puts a filter on our memory and what we remember. But the point is that when I read what Mary wrote about the genocide, I absolutely believe it. It's the stuff later on that I'm kind of like, oh well, but the trauma, I absolutely believe. All right, so that's just something to keep in mind as you really try to approach these difficult stories. This, like have the right person ask the questions, is coupled with start light and build to harder questions. So I had this experience within the past year. My in-laws came over and I thought, I'm going to ask them some hard questions. I'm going to interview them. I'm going to get some family history because there's just not a lot of talk. Within the first year of our marriage, my mother-in-law said, we don't talk about our feelings. And I thought, well, I talk about my feelings all the time. I sat down to do this interview with them and totally chickened out. I said, I'm going to ask you some hard questions and started light and could not do it. And they started talking and they were comfortable because they were light questions and my daughter was next to me. You know, their spunky, lovely granddaughter who they love. And all of a sudden she's like, boom! And she sends the zinger out and like asks this really personal question. And I was like, oh my goodness. They answered. They were already talking. It was their granddaughter asking the question. And so I then, you know, eventually after she asked a few more questions, I was able to say, what about Grandpa? He was in the war. What happened? He crash landed on this island. And what I was told is he never talked about it. We found out that he'd gotten like medals of honor and all kinds of stuff his kids never even knew about. Never knew he got medals of honor, never knew anything. And he was already dead. We could not get those stories. But you could see this 5-generational model. He never talked about it. The opportunity for healing had passed. All of those secrets, gone. Okay, the other thing is, if you're getting them started talking about it and they're older and you know memory's a funny thing, start in chronological order. So start in childhood, have them work their way up. Do your research, know what they lived through historically. Where were you when JFK was shot? Do you remember what it was like when you know this happened or that happened? And help to trigger their memory so they can put themselves in that moment. Okay, I love these two extremes, right? Be specific or be super open. But it's really important, so you can be specific. What happened when your mother died? But do you really know if that was the worst thing that happened in their childhood? Because maybe when dad remarried, having stepmom come in was a lot worse than when mom died. So be specific, but also be very open. The way I imagine this, first one, is if you know, prepare them, right? These stories are so important. I know it's difficult to talk about. Here are some questions I want you to look at. You can take your time. I'm going to go and mow your lawn. I'm going to go and make some snacks. When I come back in, we can talk about it. Chocolate's great. Anything that makes them feel good. To eat, to snack. Just try to make it a comfortable environment. And if they really cannot talk about it, then let them know, you know what, that's okay. Write it, I will come back and I will pick it up from you. Of course, family histories, you're not necessarily going to look for an agent and try to get a publisher for your family history. So you're looking at boutique printing. They have like a boutique printer in St. Louis. I tried to contact to get prices, never even contacted me back. So I'm just going to say go online. They have online boutique printers. You have to order like 24 books when you do that through them, and they ship you all 24 books, and then you have to ship it out to all your different family members. I have to say it's not my favorite. And in my experience from what I looked at, so when you talk about paper quality, you're talking about weight. And they did not have the same quality of paper as Amazon or Barnes & Noble did. So you're just going to get a higher quality going with Barnes & Noble or Amazon. About Amazon, so I actually have these on Amazon. They're not necessarily live right now on their market. If you print through Amazon, you have to put it on their bookstore. So if you're not comfortable doing that, you don't want to go through Amazon. The other thing is Amazon has a really stiff markup. It was $67 to have this printed, and you can get, so these are all proofs for me. So you can order a copy for like the cost of their printing, then you have to pay for shipping. And you can use it to make corrections, right? And I'm always making mistakes, so I probably order like 200 printer's proofs. Speed really quick. So, oh wait though, Barnes & Noble, they do offer, excuse me, they do offer the option of doing a personal print. So they are like a boutique office where you don't have to put it on their bookstore. And so you can just do a personal print. I tried ordering a book from them. So this one, and this is the memoir I most recently finished. I ordered this on Amazon, so uploaded the files and everything like that. Within 4 days, I had this book. Of course, it's a soft cover. I was getting the same book through Barnes & Noble. It's been 3 weeks and they still haven't printed it. So the same quality of materials, supposedly, but just a lot longer. So that's something also to keep in mind when it comes to printing. There's one more thing. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, Kindle. All right, so this book, this is my grandfather's book. He wrote his journal in a dead language. It's Armeno-Turkish. It took me 9 months just to find a translator for this language. And so I have a scan of his journal and I have the transcription. We have it in modern Turkish, translated into modern Turkish. We have it in English. This is like my family's Rosetta Stone. I prefer the physical copy of this book so that I can see the pages side by side. However, I have 100 nieces and nephews, and a lot of them are young enough that they're not going to spend $67 on that book. I have the Kindle version available on Amazon for $3. So they can't open it up and see it page, side by side, but it's a really great option. Like, it makes it so much more accessible for every member of the family to be able to do Kindle, right? And I'm sitting here with all these like books up and everything. You know what? This 3-ring binder is just as valuable. Do not feel intimidated and think, oh no, I've got to make it beautiful. No, if all you can do is an audio recording, then do an audio recording. If all you can do is a 3-ring binder, that is still better than a blank sheet of paper, right? Get it done. It doesn't have to be gorgeous. Let's talk about writing samples now. So we're going to look at like how different people have written trauma, including myself. So all of these newspaper articles are from my family. Bottom ones are of when my dad got robbed, and then 2 years later my mom was pregnant with me and got robbed, and so I was born a month early because it traumatized her. And the top one is the one that I'm actually going to get into. It's about when my aunt was murdered in 1991. I changed the names in the memoir. She was missing for 6 weeks. A bicyclist was riding up the canyon and noticed a bag off the side of the road and could smell decay, so he contacted the police. So officers went to the scene and found the remains of a woman in the bag, which they took to the coroner. The coroner found that the woman had been shot to death and identified her as Alice by her clothing. I knew to expect that she had been murdered, but until a body is found and identified, you stay in a state of limbo. There were more details the police had about the murder, but they were never made public because of the ongoing investigation. Those were the details Dad screamed after we had returned home the day of Alice's funeral. I saw him cry only once before, at Ann's funeral, but I had never seen him so unhinged. After more than 30 years, I wonder if I can ever forget the details Dad shared. For all his strength, he could no longer carry the weight of that horror on his own. Willing or not, we all share the weight with him now. So, let me pass these sheets out. When you look at trauma, when you look at telling trauma, right, I could have detailed every little thing that my dad screamed that day about the things that they did to my aunt. But that's not really the point, right? The point is what we felt. When I think about writing trauma, I do think about drawing on the emotion, because remember, family storytelling, trauma recovery, it's about processing emotion. There are times that you need the details, right? I don't think anyone needs the details of how my aunt was murdered and what happened to her. I feel like my dad needed to tell us because he needed to share that. But no one else needs to know that. You know, I can regulate that with my siblings. We can handle that. With Mary's journal, with her memoir, we need those details. That's a historic event that has been drawn into question. Oh, the genocide never happened. And when you read the details of what she wrote, it follows the criteria for genocide. So there's no way I would rewrite her memoir, but what I would do is, okay, I would do a softened version and then I would have an appendix, or I would have a separate version of her, you know, her handwritten account, her personal account, so that you have a way of kind of softening it for people. And then if they say, okay, now I'm ready to read that account, then they can make that choice themselves, right? So I would have the two records. But there's no way on earth I would ever change the fact that she wrote this with as much detail as she did. So I'm going to take just an example from her memoir. I try to make it as brief as I could. So if you look on the genocide section, first I'm going to read her original account, and then I'm going to read how I would change it to soften what she says. And so you know this is about genocide. They've already marched parents off to the Euphrates River and shot them. And then while they were there at the Euphrates, the parents were asking, you know, what about our children? What about our children? And they said, well, we're going to put them in an orphanage. And so this is what they do with the children after they've already killed the parents. Mary was left with her younger sister in the house of an Arabic woman, Fatima Fawd. And Mary called her, you know, Mother Fatima, or Fatima Mother. And when her parents went missing, the day before, they left their daughters with Fatima. And Fatima locked them in her house and would not let them out. So 3 days pass, and Mary is just at this point of being frantic. Where's my mother? Where's my father? And her younger sister, and they're constantly crying. Fatima tries to address that. Let me read from her personal account first. I could not eat anything. All I could do was cry. The doors were still locked and no one came. Her parents had promised to come back. Finally, Fatima said to me, "Be quiet and stop your crying. Tonight I will show you something you will never forget in all your life." All day I waited. Around 10 p.m., Fatima took me to the roof of the house. The houses in the Middle East all have flat roofs. Fatima Mother said to me, "Look toward the Khan, where the village shepherds bring their flocks." That day they did not bring their flocks. All around the Khan was a very large field where they piled brush, thorns, and wood. Over this, gasoline had been poured. Inside the Khan, all the Armenian children that could be found had been gathered. All the children from ages 2 to 10, homeless, sick, their parents killed. Some of them, my cousins and friends, were inside. The wood was set on fire, and the flame leaped into the heavens and around the children. They could not escape. And all we could hear was their screaming and crying. It was a horrible scene. I fell to the floor and did not open my eyes until morning. In the morning, I could not stand on my feet. I was like a drunken man. I thought I had had a nightmare. I went to Mother Fatima and said to her, "What was that? Last night, did I have a nightmare?" She took me in her arms and said to me, "My darling poor girl, what you saw was the burning of the children." Okay, so how I would soften that if I were to do this. That's why I never picked that book up again after college, right? All around the con was a very large field where they piled brush, thorns, and wood. Over this, gasoline had been poured. Inside the con, they gathered all the Armenian children from ages 2 to 10, homeless, sick, their parents killed, some of them my cousins and friends. This was the orphanage the gendarmes had promised the parents before shooting them near the Euphrates River. The wood was lit, and a scene from a nightmare rose with the smoke of the fire. I think of the words of a lullaby I had heard sung by mothers and grandmothers many times in the con as they put a crying child to sleep. In the quiet tent of Christ, many little lambs live comfortably, and there is no fear. In the morning, I could not stand on my feet. I was like a drunken man. Okay, and then it continues on from there. Here I say tips for writing trauma. So drawing on the emotion more than on the details of the trauma, which is what I did with my aunt, right? I talked about my dad screaming about the pain. I talked about sharing the horror of what happened. Give just enough information that the reader does know what happened. And so that's basically euphemisms, right? Euphemisms are effective. So let's go ahead and turn to rape. And we'll read the first 2 examples of rape. Does anyone, this is such a weird class. Does anyone want to read the first example of rape? Would you like to?
I will.
Okay.
The Turkish soldiers would search for all Armenians, and if they resisted, they would kill or crucify them. They would insult the beautiful girls and women. Then as they killed them, they would say, "Now let your Jesus come and save you."
Okay, so obviously we have the euphemism there of they would insult them, right? Harbor Lee from To Kill a Mockingbird. I got something to say and then I ain't gonna say no more. That man yonder took advantage of me, and if you fine fancy gentlemen don't want to do nothing about it, then you're all yellow, stinking cowards. Stinking cowards, the lot of you. Your fancy airs don't come to nothing. Your mammon and your Miss Mayellerin don't come to nothing, Mr. Finch. So there we still have the emotion, right? And yet that lovely euphemism of he took advantage of me, right? When I read some of these to my daughters, they had no idea what it was talking about, which is just kind of lovely, right? They didn't know. And yet for an audience who's kind of more prepared to hear it, like we get what's being said, right? And so this emotion that, you know, Mayeller is expressing is, you know, of course, we know that she's like lying in the story, but okay. So this last tip, right? Dissociate from the feeling and concentrate on the ethics. So the thing about trauma is that generally in some way someone is wronged. You've got murder, you've got abuse, you've got assault, all of these things. And there's that part of us who wants the bad guy to get it and the good guy to triumph. But that doesn't happen, right? This third example of rape is where I kind of play to that idea of let's talk about the ethics of it. I like to imagine a policeman coming onto the scene, saving Sue and taking Darren into custody. He would have been booked and charged and sent to prison for 10 years on assault charges. Sadly, this did not happen. And at the normal time, Sue gave birth to a son. The love and welcoming she hoped would surround the birth of her first child was replaced by pain and shame. Right? So we can respect the emotion and we can talk about like, oh, don't we wish that happened, you know? But then acknowledge just kind of the reality of the emotional aftermath. If you don't have any examples, then we can brainstorm. Like, I do not have any examples of suicide. So a quick question would be, if you were to approach suicide in your family history, using any of the tips or anything that you think of beyond that, how would you approach that?
My grandmother told a story of her brother who was, I don't know, in his 20s, but, you know, had been married had an alcohol problem, and his wife and kids were leaving. And she came to see, the wife came to see him and said she was leaving and she was coming back in a few hours to get her things. And in the meantime, he drank lye and killed himself.
Wow. So your family tells that story, and what was it like for you the first time you heard that? Do you feel like it traumatized you? Do you feel like it was?
It was more like lie. That's what a horrible death that must have been. It was just, I just sort of thought about what an awful way to die.
So what did you get from that? Because, we know that telling family stories, I mean, I look at that and I think to myself, how do I make sure I don't end up in a situation where I'm the one drinking lye, right? So what did you get out of it? How old were you when you first heard that story?
Oh, I was probably, I don't know, 10, 12, something like that.
So young enough.
Yeah. I got to think about he just had this terrible drinking problem. Because he wasn't that old. He was in his 20s. And had already been married a couple of times. And
so you can see, right, how we had those groups earlier, like the low risk taking and the moderate risk taking, and how those family stories teach us about what to avoid.
yeah. And then I'd always heard about my grandma, like, I guess grandpa had something to drink or had a bottle, and if you ever brought anything into the house, she just poured it down the drain. She just wouldn't have anything to do with drinking.
So we have that combination of stories, right? The kind of like tragic vulnerability and the conscious choice to change the family story. I'm like, I don't have to do this, I'm not going to. All right, any questions? Any comments?
How would you soften that story?
The suicide one?
Yeah.
I think, I would definitely look at it as a longer story, and I would, at the end, I would take the wife and the children and look at their story especially and say, how did they survive, right? Did they learn? Did they move forward? Did they break the cycle? And that's really where I think I would focus on, is breaking that cycle. So I had an autoimmune disorder that I didn't have diagnosed until a couple of years ago, and I was slipping into dementia, and I had anemia and was super sick. And so I know what it's like to think, like, my kids would be better off without me, because I can't even function, right? I was so anemic and just so sick. And the dementia has all of its own set of symptoms. And so I had those. I'm a big sissy when it comes to pain. So I can't imagine myself ever doing that. But I thought, I would think, how would I want them to write my suicide story? And I would think, I would want to know that my kids got diagnosed, that they found out that there was something chemically wrong with me, and that they fixed that for the next generation. Fortunately, I get to be that story of I got diagnosed. I get to fix it for the next generation, And I have that actually in my memoir. It's called Coming Full Circle, looking at me me being the same age as my daughter, right? And my daughter saying, Mom, your dementia scared me, but I am now being treated and the symptoms have totally gone down, versus me being with my mom and saying, Mom, like I'm scared. You stop in the middle of a sentence and you can't finish your sentence, and just the difference in what knowledge does. Right? So that's really, I think, when I think about suicide, I absolutely think, where are we going to grow? Not just go, but where are we going to grow? So that's, I don't think I mentioned this one. I kind of stuck these around the room. There's a QR code on the back. If you're interested in any of the studies, and there are even more studies, this lists all of the benefits of of knowing your family stories, the benefits for youth are so amazing, even cognitive benefits, where they did this study in Austria, and they would have people think about a family story for 5 minutes, and they had different groups think about different things. The people that thought about their ancestor did better cognitively on the test than every other group. So, I mean, that's just one of my favorite examples of, but yeah, so if you want to look at the research, it's linked to a page, and I've said that I will put my PowerPoint on the same page from this presentation, so if you want to take one of those then.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.